Hello, everyone who has joined so far. We'll just wait another minute so that everybody is able to get from the talk to our Q&A. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the discussion. And thank you, Hanna Meretoja, for being here with us today. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. Welcome also to the audience. And a reminder, please use the Q&A tool to send in your questions. You can find it on the bottom of your screen. And while the questions are slowly coming in, I would like to ask the first one myself. But first, Hanna, would you like to say hello to our audience?
Yeah, hello everyone. It's great. I can't see you, but it's great you. Thank you for listening for my talk. I look forward to the discussion, and thank you also, Irene, for the invitation. I'm honored to be part of this great event.
Thank you so much. So you were talking about war language and war rhetoric in your talk. And on an individual level, it may make us feel having agency, right? But we'd agree that this is not really what we mean when we think about agency. It's more like an illusion of control, right? And I appreciate you mentioning how war rhetoric contributes and is used to pursue political and nationalist goals. I think that's a very, very important aspect of it. Trump saying China doesn't fight hard enough, for example. So war language is used to turn nations against each other, as you said. I think it's also used to discipline people and to foster nationalist ideas of the us fighting against the enemy. And at the same time, other countries who supposedly are not fighting hard enough become therefore also enemies, not only the virus, right? So we've heard about Trump's rhetoric and the language he's using at this conference in several talks. And Stan McAdams yesterday pointed out Trump as the episodic man who sees life as a series of battles but can't manage to make a meaningful life story. So in the light of the current COVID-19 crisis, I feel there is a lot of individual narratives we have easily access to. So due to the lockdowns, people, at least this is my impression, even more share their stories publicly on podcasts and blogs and web pages. And those COVID-19 stories probably, I don't know, will be becoming a new genre right now. And some of them we probably identify with, and some of them seem very strange or unfamiliar to us. So as I understand for what you told us about narrative imagination, we need to be aware of the idea that my point of view is only one out of a number of perspectives, right? That is a particular standpoint from which I look at the world and tell my story. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more what understanding of how different worlds work actually could mean and what that could include, and how far can such an understanding or insight or reflection go? So are we capable at all of fully understanding others' COVID-19 stories? For example, as you mentioned, stories of individuals in precarious situations, non-privileged, marginalized groups.
Yeah, thank you so much for this thoughtful response. I think there are different aspects to that question. One issue is to what extent we are really aware of the diversity of the different experiences, different worlds from which people experience this pandemic. Earlier this morning there was a talk on how people in war context have a very different experience, well, in actual war, in armed conflict, who are already in that kind of experiential world, and then there's this additional anxiety and fear linked to the pandemic. So, for example, when we use this war rhetoric, I think there's a lot of insensitivity to that. For example, very little awareness of in how difficult situations people are, especially those who are in actual war context. And I think we live in our sort of social bubbles. So a lot of this talk about how, for example, how boring this is. It's of course, obviously a very middle class experience that the primary problem is boredom, for example, that we can't leave our houses, and I think there should be somehow more dialogue between those different worlds right now. But obviously, the people who are in privileged positions, their voices dominate the public domain, and that's obviously a big problem. And all this talk about how we are in this together tends to sort of create this illusion of sort of homogeneous experience of the pandemic. And then there's of course the whole issue, if we talk about narrative imagination, the plurality of worlds, of future worlds, that the different worlds that we may be heading towards. Also when we talk about those worlds, we should also be sensitive to how the choices we make and political decisions we make right now, how they will affect different segments of society and people in different countries very differently. So somehow we should be able to think about that plurality both in the current time right now and when we think about the future. And it's not easy, but somehow we should at least acknowledge this and try to make more space for those experiences in the public domain, for the stories of people who are in difficult positions, and yeah. So I think that's a very important point.
So also the question, do we even hear those stories or listen to the stories in the first place, right?
Yeah, sure.
I have two questions that somehow I think go in a somewhat same direction. One is Brian Schiff's question, and another one is Mark Freeman's question. And if you're okay with it, I will just try to ask both. Brian says, thank you, Hanna, for such a wonderful and thoughtful talk. Obviously, the war narrative is an instrumental narrative. Can you comment on how to engage, or should we say combat, such narratives without making another instrumental narrative? Or should we engage in our own versions of instrumental narratives in a sense?
Yeah, so yeah, it depends also how we understand instrumentality, but I think in a way it's inevitable that we use stories to make sense of the world. So there is that aspect of use somehow linked to how this whole process of narrative sense making, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. So so there's like use and abuse of narratives for different purposes, and we should have more reflection and discussion on what purposes stories serve, why politicians privilege certain stories, and for example this war story, what is it used for? I do know that some people can find it somehow empowering, so it's not like simple, it's not a simple thing. Like people experience obviously the whole war narrative in very different ways, and different national contexts affect that experience as well. And I think there is also maybe a gendered aspect to it. So it often seems to me that of course I don't want to generalize, but I have come across more women being uncomfortable with that war rhetoric. and also many of the leading politicians are these sort of macho style politicians who are really fond of that rhetoric. Yeah, so maybe I've lost a bit the question, but this sort of whole aspect of instrumentality, I think it's so in a way it's unavoidable, but I don't. For me personally, there are more problems than benefits in using the war narrative as an instrument for trying to understand the pandemic. And also, I think it is obvious that it is used a lot for very problematic political purposes to legitimize things that at least I'm not comfortable with. But I'm also, of course, open to different views on that. Some people might experience it very differently.
Then maybe let me continue at this point with Mark Freeman's question. He says, thank you, Hanna, for your moving, humane talk. I absolutely agree. You've made an excellent case, he said, for the deep problems with the war metaphor. It does have power, though, power to rally those warriors eager for battle. What might be a more appropriate metaphor, and how might it gather the kind of energy, if not power, needed to sustain people in connection and care? What would be your own rallying cry?
Well, thank you for that comment and question. I think I'm not sure if I want to have a rallying cry, but I think there is what I talked about that towards the end of my talk about this narrative of solidarity, the kind of possibility that this could be a health crisis is always potentially a kind of wake-up call in a way. It was, I brought in my own experience of my cancer last year, which was very much a kind of wake-up call for me. Like, it makes you really face the fragility of life, which we tend to sort of, as long as we are healthy, we don't really want to think about it, and we have this often this kind of illusion of control. So just I think this crisis could really make us realize this shared fragility of life, and then sort of reevaluate things from a new perspective. What we want to take from the world we left behind to the new world we are going to, the post-pandemic world, and what we don't want to. So I think it's a chance to sort of not go back to the old normal, but try to really evaluate what kind of world would it be if we really acknowledge this fundamental truth that we are all vulnerable and we are all potentially, basically we are all mortal, and the COVID-19 or any other illness could destruct us anytime in principle. So we are not invincible, we're not invulnerable in that sense, and no matter how healthy lifestyles or whatever we have, we don't really have that kind of control over our lives. So we could have this kind of understanding of our dependence on others, on the care of others and support of others, and just this interdependence and shared vulnerability as a starting point for something new. So this kind of sense of some kind of narrative of solidarity based on this understanding of our fundamental dependence on others and shared destructibility that we all have. Even though I think it is both a shared condition, but we also have to remember here that the structural inequalities that some people are even in more precarious positions, but that it could also happen to us, to the privileged people. This could be that kind of wake-up call. So something along the lines of that shared sense of interdependency and vulnerability and solidarity based on that understanding, and also this sort of some kind of global awareness based on how dependent we are also on the shared planet. Also, this environmental aspect, I think, should be very important part of this if we want to narrate it as a kind of chance to move towards some kind of different world, a different future. So something along those lines. I think it's kind of idealistic, but it is something that I think this is a unique possibility to really build kind of joint resistance on the unsustainable way of life we have had, and that has also led to this pandemic. But please suggest what would be your rallying cry, and and I think we just should make space for more like different kinds of narrative instead of the war narrative, and once that opens something, the possibility of something something better in the future.
There's another question that sorry.
No, just please continue. Yeah.
There's another question that picks up the interconnectedness and solidarity. So I would like to read this to you. Thank you, Hanna. War is a very limiting narrative or metaphor, and as you pointed up, pointing in the wrong direction. Nevertheless, the war metaphor brings to the fore one component that the founders of the stress and coping paradigm seem to have suggested, and that is the moving toward aspect, in contrast to the moving away aspect of navigating the direction of fit of the person and world relationship. And the argument there was and is that the moving toward stance, if we want to call it, has a better survival rate, or more generally is a healthier move. So my question is, Michael Bamberg says, whether this aspect can be incorporated into the or a equality and solidarity narrative that stresses people's interconnectedness.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not familiar with this approach. So I'm not sure if I completely understood, but so as far as I understood, I do think it probably is compatible. That would be my initial sense, at least. But I would love to hear more what you think, for example, about that and how it could be incorporated. But I don't see any obvious contradiction. But I might have missed something.
Rimi is asking something that I was also very interested in. She says, I was wondering about the sense of solidarity formed through social media narratives. Could you comment on this aspect of digital narrative?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, I do think that social media is an important potential, or it has potential for kind of international mobilization of people, in the sense of creating, it could be something that would allow the creation of kind of global movement of resistance, the kind of viral resistance that Ian Parker talked about earlier. So, for example, if you think of the Me Too movement was an example of how big role social media can play in creating this kind of global movement, or for example, the Fridays for Future phenomenon, or many other examples nowadays. So there is potential for that, but there is also, of course, the risk in social media that it tends to easily favor sort of the individual experience, and this, when we live in our own social bubbles, we might be just like listening to these individual stories of how I experienced the pandemic and how I survived and so on. So there's also this challenge of how to make room for different kinds of voices and really bring people from different worlds together, and not just people from the same kind of social bubble. So there are certainly challenges and risks, but also potential, I would say.
So you would say, like, those narrative in-betweens not only make it possible for us to imagine new relationships and build community, but probably also apply that probably also this applies to new modes of establishing and practicing relationship, like we are doing right now, not only family and friends, but also students and conference participants.
That's a really important point, that this what I call the narrative in between, that it's not only about the sort of content of the intersubjective worlds, but also how also about the media, what makes possible these new relationships, and that's where the digital media do play a key role, that we can actually make these create these new spaces that have already started to form, that we can, for example, this conference is a good example of something. I've never been part of this kind of conference before, and I think it's a marvelous chance to really bring people together from all over the world in a way that normal conference wouldn't be. Of course, we also lose something, but we also there is a certain kind of inclusivity. For example, not having fees. It is open for everyone. I really like that aspect of this conference, that it's open for everyone. So we digital media have this possibility if we want to use them for making new connections and bringing people together, and not for profit. So we can actually do new things and bring people together, and sort of, in terms of narrative in between, I distinguish between like exclusive and inclusive narrative in betweens, and I think this is an example of creating inclusiveness to that kind of narrative in between, that dialogue that brings inclusively people together. Of course, there's still the challenge to bring this kind of events to awareness of people in very different kinds of worlds, but still, at least there's the potential for that.
Brian Schiff just posted, along this point, aren't we creating a narrative in between here?
Yeah, I do think that in a way all intersubjective dialogue is about creating narrative in-betweens and perpetuating and challenging dominant forms of narrative in-between. So all dialogue between people is about also negotiating different kinds of narratives, and what kind of narratives we share and what kind of narratives we disagree about, and this whole dialogue about narratives is a key aspect of the narrative in between us, that both connect people and but can also keep people apart. So narratives do both; they both connect and disconnect people. So this whole negotiation about what narratives we want to contribute to and what narratives we want to problematize is important part of negotiating the narrative in between us, for example, right now. So yes.
Gordana Jovanovic asks, we live in modern culture, which is described as psychological culture. Usually psychological culture is interpreted in a humanistic key, as an expression of acknowledgement of the value of psychical aspects of human life. But it seems that psychological culture entails also quite a lot of epistemic and moral arrogance. You addressed critically, and right so. I think changes are needed, also beyond narrative approach. How would you comment on that?
Yes, definitely. I think it's important to also see the limits of narrative, and it's not all about narratives. And also this whole aspect of how it's often moralistic narratives that get a lot of space in the media. They, in a way, that kind of simplistic narratives that tell you what to do. This kind of normative narratives are often privileged both in politics and media. And we should also critically discuss that normative aspect and that moralistic aspect of many narratives, but I don't think it's necessarily all narratives that do that. So I think it's also important to see that there are very different kinds of narratives. There are ones that are more open and more explorative, and then ones that have this very sort of dogmatic, moralistic message. So, so if we talk about the form of narratives, I think we need more that kind of open-ended, explorative narratives right now, especially as we are now very much in the middle of this event that's unfolding right now. So we can't narrate it in that kind of closed way. Even also for that reason, we can't narrate it as a story with a beginning, middle, and end, because we are right in the middle of it. So that's why I talked about this aspect of narratives holding open certain possibilities, but also because narratives tend to privilege the perspective of kind of experiential subject, somebody who is in a certain situation experiencing something. That's also why there are limits to narratives. So there are very complex phenomena and processes that are not necessarily best understood in narrative terms. So narrative is not always the best way to understand some complex phenomena like the climate crisis, for example, and also the pandemic. It's not, you can't tell like a simple story about the narrative. So when I published a version of my criticism of the war story in Open Democracy, it came out just a few days ago, and the editor wanted to talk about, sort of have this kind of line in the beginning about this, the story in the singular. So I think it's, for me, it's very problematic to talk about like a story of the pandemic in the singular, because it's not something, it's so complex phenomenon that we can't tell like one story about the pandemic. We use narratives to make sense of it and different aspects of it, but we can't like force it into any one narrative. So that's why also I think we need criticism of narrative as a when it's used in that kind of closed and singular and normative way. I'm not sure if that's what you were thinking about, but this is something that often when I talk about the stories that we use to make sense of narrative of the pandemic, then people want to know what would be the like, right narrative. I don't think it's that simple in a way. We need a whole like dialogue of narratives, and we also need self-criticism and criticism of all narratives that pretend that they are the only one, not the right one. But I just wanted to now focus on the problems of this war narrative, which is often told as a kind of comprehensive and kind of has this kind of totalizing aspect to it quite often. But it's not like I would have the right narrative in my pocket. So yeah, it's a very, that's one of the challenges of living, that we can't really reduce it to any one narrative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beatrice says, first of all, I would like to thank you for the inspiring talk. It was wonderful, really. Also, I wanted to ask you, I come from Italy and I have several friends who are healthcare workers who have been trying to do what they could to take care of COVID patients. But many of them do use the metaphor of war, fighting the virus, working on the front line, etc. And they explained to me that it is because of the exceptional conditions in which they work. The concept of care could not really be applied to a context in which patients were too many to know their name, where spaces were inadequate and everything was just too overwhelming. They stressed the practical reality of endurance and suffering and depersonalizing caring. Is caring still caring if you're not in the conditions to care? How can we help healthcare workers place themselves as narrative of care when they were the first to be thrown in a situation where care does not resemble care at all?
Thank you for that really, really important insight and response. I do think that that's one reason why this war rhetoric is so much used, is this attempt to convey the exceptionalism, the exceptional situation that we are in. And there is also an aspect of fighting, but at least struggling. I don't know, sometimes I find myself, like, it's very difficult not to use this this language of fighting, but I think there's also different kinds of struggling and fighting. So it's not like I think the war metaphor takes it one step further, because war is, for me at least, war is something that takes place that doesn't work in the non-human context, because war involves armies battling against each other and this whole like strategies and tactics and so on. So none of that applies to the virus. So yeah, so I completely understand that experience, that it's not just like normal care, because there is this extremity of the whole situation. But there are also other kinds of catastrophes, like natural catastrophes, for example, that something extreme happens and we have to respond to it way that we don't normally. We have to sort of find resources and from our aspects from ourselves that we necessarily didn't know that were there, or we're able to. We really have to like struggle in a way that we don't usually have to. But I don't think it makes it still. It doesn't make it a war. At least for me, it's not the helpful metaphor to capture that exceptional struggle. There are non-violent struggles, and often for example, even our history is very much dominated by like kind of violent conflicts and violent struggles. But there are also non-violent struggles. People strive to achieve all kinds of things, often in very extreme conditions, and it's not all about war. So so I do understand that some people might find the war the kind of metaphor that works for them, but in a kind of general, in the kind of magnitude that this metaphor has been given in media, how much it dominates the public space, I think it probably, at least that's my sense, that it does more harm than good the way it's been used now. But I still appreciate that point of view, and I haven't myself been in that kind of extreme position. In for example, my two brothers work in a hospital in Helsinki, and from them I've heard a bit. I've received a bit of like insight into what it's like, even though in Finland it hasn't been as tough as in many other countries, but the kind of issues they have to think about, and the whole like what's going on in that kind of health sector right now. So I can only sort of imagine it a bit, but I can't really, I don't have any first-hand experience. So I do appreciate that that experience that you commented on.
Thank you very much. I think that's like an important point. I have the feeling we haven't talked a lot about publicly healthcare workers in recent times, and now they suddenly become visible, and they either depicted as war heroes or as very vulnerable group of people who work with patients. So that's quite interesting how this kind of two different narratives or different pictures differ here when we think about care work, right? Jens Brockmeyer says, lovely talk, Hanna, strong points. I particularly liked your emphasis on alternatives to the strong metaphors and storylines of war and battle. That is, to explore the narrative options of solidarity, humility, and vulnerability. Perhaps this could also offer a categorical bridge to what you described as narrative dialogicity, and more generally, the perspectives of dialogical hermeneutics. Maybe you might want to elaborate a bit on this bridge.
Yes, thank you. So this is also very much what I was trying to point at when Mark Freeman asked about what would be like what kind of narratives I would privilege. So so very much along these lines of of emphasizing the dialogical aspect of our existence. And this is something that in my theoretical work, which I've worked with Jens Brockmeyer with about narrative hermeneutics, and developed that approach to narrative studies, and also with Mark Freeman and many others who are part of this conference. I think that's a key insight in narrative hermeneutics, that narratives are about interpreting the world, and this interpretation is always somehow dialogical in a way that narratives always takes shape in dialogue with other narratives. And we are fundamentally dialogical beings, so our whole existence and sense of self takes shape in dialogue with others. And I think this, in a way, it always happens, this dialogue at some level, but we also need more sort of open. Now we have to sort of amplify this aspect of our existence right now, because we are isolated in different worlds, and we need this dialogue we talked about earlier, the dialogue between different worlds right now, so that we could, it would make more sense to say that we are in this together if we had a stronger dialogue going on between different people in different worlds experiencing the pandemic. So I think it's, in a way, this dialogical condition of human existence is about it's inescapable, and we should acknowledge it as kind of basis of our existence. But it's also something that we should work towards to strengthen this kind of open dialogue between different narratives and different worlds. That's also, I think, a key aspect of what kind of narratives I would like to see going on, or sort of having more space in the public space right now, is the kind of dialogical narratives that acknowledge that they are just narratives told from a certain perspective and certain point of view, and are welcoming towards other narratives. So we should strengthen this aspect in ourselves, this openness to other people's narratives and other narrative perspectives on the pandemic. So thank you, Jens, for the comment.
Thank you. I think we have time for only one more question. There's so many beautiful and important questions still here. I will post them all on Slack so we can keep in a discussion. Flo van Alphen says, thanks, Hanna, for your lovely talk. I was wondering whether the narrative, as it usually implies some meaningful closure, is the indicated means for opening up the discourse for other imaginations in times of great uncertainty. The other day we were talking about this and thought that maybe art or poetry are more useful as means for opening up other futures of solidarity and sustainability than the one imagined through nationalist or war narratives. Just a thought we were entertaining. What do you think?
Yes, I definitely agree. About the idea that narratives imply a closure, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are different forms of narratives. So not all narratives have this kind of closed form. And I think we do need this kind of open-ended narratives right now, this kind of explorative narratives. And I think art is the best possible way, literature and other arts, to foster that kind of imagination, our ability to engage with these kind of open-ended explorative narratives that help us imagine different futures and more sustainable, more just future worlds. So I do think that maybe also because of my background in literary studies, I think we need we need all kinds of open-ended narratives, but especially art and literature tend to, at least good literature tends to have sort of foster our ethical imagination, in that sense that it's more about kind of ethical inquiry, about helping us ask questions than providing set answers or singular stories, more about sort of amplifying our narrative agency in that sense that we are capable of imagining different kinds of futures in dialogue with others. So yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hanna Meretoja, for your wonderful talk and for the great discussion. And thank you, everyone, for your great question. It was a pleasure. And I hope we can continue our discussion on Slack. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for everyone for your wonderful, engaging questions. And I really enjoyed the discussion, and let's continue it in Slack. So thank you.
Yes, please. Wonderful.
Bye.
Bye.